One of the things that we need to think about is the idea that when we go to the seaside, it's what we call dynamic. The energy from the sea changes for several reasons. It changes because of the season, it changes because of the time of year, as in time of day, and it will also change with the phase of the moon. So when we go and visit the seaside, there's a chance that the tide will be out and there's a chance that the tide will be in, and it will change daily. So what we've noticed as we have become seaside dwelling visitors, we've noticed that actually the sand might move. And people like sandy beaches. So the groins that we see in this image here have been there to protect the sand from moving. We have an idea that sand moves by the process of longshore drift. And what happens is you get a piece of sand in the water there, and as the water flows down the beach, it will pick up that sand and it will drag it forward, but it actually gets stuck on that side of the beach. So you can tell when you walk down the beach which way the tide is flowing, simply because it's like it becomes a stepped feature. One side of the groin is higher than the other, and that is designed to slow down the movement of beaches. So there are several different planning methods which will accommodate coastal erosion. Now, you can see that the house here is literally hanging on a cliff edge, and there is debris at the foot of the cliff because the houses have been built on soft sedimentary rock. And the geology of an area does influence the kind of erosion that it experiences. What are the soft and hard engineering advantages and disadvantages of the coast? We're going to come back and look at the differences between hard and soft engineering. And one of the things that I would like you to think about is, if you have been to a beach already, can you be familiar? Have you already recognised without realising that there are groins, that there are sea walls, and that these are actually human methods in trying to control coastal erosion? Because coastal erosion costs money. When somebody loses their house into the sea, it is not only the value of the property that is lost, it is somebody's home. And it might have been that when they moved into that house, it could have been 30 years ago, and that the coast was actually 100 meters away. So time changes coastal erosion suddenly and can be sometimes overnight. It is, if you go up to Anglesey in the north coast, there are areas there where you can have a beach for years and years and years, and then you get this intense storm, and all the sand that's been dragged onto the beach suddenly gets dragged out to sea, and all you're left with is pebbles. So all these factors need to be considered. But the other thing that's now becoming very evident is, how can climate change affect coastal communities, not only within the UK, but also in countries such as the Maldives, where water level really can make a difference to the quality of life. So, hard engineering, coastal management methods. If you think of a map of Great Britain, there will be certain places which are more prone to erosion because their geology is softer, and there will be more places. There's some places which are less prone to erosion because their geology is harder. And it tends to be the places with the softer erosion that gets protected. So here we've got an artificial method of involving putting masses of concrete down effectively to create a permanent structure to protect the coast from erosion. And it's called hard engineering because it's permanent, but it's also expensive. In this diagram here, what we have is this particular piece of rock isn't a natural feature. It will have been dumped by a JCB to protect the sea wall. So before the wave rises up and curves back on itself, the wave energy dissipates. it means that it gets broken down. So instead of being incredibly strong and powerful, because it's kind of had to break down over these uneven surface here, by the time it hits the seawall and comes back on itself, the energy has been lessened. And when you have less energy, you have less erosion. But if you were to go further up the coast, so if you were to go from Aberaeron, for example, up towards Borth, you'll find that there are areas of sand dune, and these sand dunes are nature's natural protection to changing the way that coasts are developed. And soft engineering tends to be where little involvement is made to try and alter what's going on. So, for example, these sand dunes, they won't have a high population living there. There won't be high intensive agricultural land to protect. People might enjoy going there for a walk, but they tend to be lower investment. So soft engineering doesn't cost very much. Hard engineering costs quite a bit. The run up to the wave run up is a lot longer, and quite often what shapes the features here isn't actually the water, but it's the influence of wind, because sand particles can be carried by the wind. Now, hard engineering, groins. Most of them are actually pretty ancient these days. They may have been built anywhere between the Victorian era through to the 1950s, 1960s. Or they can be made of rock. They're built at a square angle to the sea. And again, it's the idea that you might have, let's think, if we've got Wales, this is South Wales here, what you will find is that you've got groins sticking out to the sea, and the longshore drift carries the sediment up the beach, and people want to keep their bit of beach, so they slow it down by putting groins in, because people like beaches. So people are encouraged to go to sandy beaches, therefore you get more tourism, and they are a way of controlling the sediment. Whereas the disadvantage is, by catching the sediment, you protect the beaches further down the coastline, but you actually affect where erosion takes place further on down. And there are some places on the south of England in particular, near Bournemouth, where Bournemouth has tried to catch all the sand, and then further on to the east, because the longshore drift flows from west to east, there are beaches which have been depleted of sand. There's a good word to add into your, it means that they have got less sand, and people think that they look ugly. Wouldn't it be lovely if we didn't have to look at the groins? But they are a familiar sight. They are effective in what they do. So they've become familiar, but they are effective. They are expensive though. They do get storm damage. They are worn away because the sea is a powerful tool. The rocks within the sea will bash these groins. The sediment in the sea will bash these groins, so they can be damaged. But because they're so expensive, they're not often readily replaced immediately. They tend to just be a feature. So, seawalls. Seawalls are really expensive. They cost about £2,000 per metre. So when one next walks across the length of Aberystwyth Beach and one thinks about the amount of money that's been invested in the seawall, it's there because it's protecting the town. Similar sort of thing. You've got these large boulders in front. They are called riprap. And the reason they're called riprap is because they are literally riprap. They are large boulders, in front of the seawall. Mechanical diggers have to put them in place. There's a lot of expense. You've got the moving of the riprap from the quarry in which it was blasted, so it's going to have to travel by road to get to the beach. So there's been an awful lot of investment to prevent and slow down erosion. It's important to say that this seawall doesn't prevent erosion, but it does slow it down. So when we think about seawalls, you think about the advantages of them. They are an effective form of protection. And you can see people during storms actually trying to be brave and stand on the edge of the seawall and then finding themselves soaked because they underestimate the power of the wave, which gets thrown up high into the air. But the engineers who designed the seawalls have actually tried to make it so that they are people friendly. So, for example, there are many steps down so that you can still access the beach, and so that people can walk along it. You'll find that there are benches so that people can sit out and sit out and look at the sea. And they run for miles because miles of coastline need to be protected. The disadvantages of these seawalls is that they are powerful and can break and erode the seawalls. They are expensive. So when we're thinking about whether we should manage coastlines and protect them for the people who live near them, we think about the cost, not only in terms of the financial cost, but also in terms of the quality of life of people living there, the agricultural land that we might be protecting, the community that might be being protected, the infrastructure, the roads, the railways. If you go to Dawlish, quite often in the winter, there is a train track running next to the seaside, and the trains stop running when there's a violent storms because the sea impacts on train tracks. If that train track gets broken, then there is a cost in repairing it. So there's a high investment where there are infrastructures. Now, gabions. Gabions are basically crates of wire which have been filled with rocks. So they aren't very attractive. They tend to be stacked up. They are quite effective because not only do you have a cage with rocks in, the rocks in the cage will, you've got the wave running up the wire frame, but it's also running into the rocks. So that's breaking down the energy more quickly. They're pretty cheap compared to concrete. They involve a lot of investment in terms of transportation to get them there. They involve things being quarried. But the way that they absorb the energy is because it takes some of the water into the cage and then it will run back out. So you've got waves running up and then it will run back out to sea. So when it runs up, it's called swash. I've pressed something, sorry. Bear with. It's called swash. We're done. Swash. Joe Swash won the I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. That's how you remember. What runs up the beach? Swash. Runs up. Backwash. Runs down. So when you are thinking to enhance your geographical vocabulary, try and say to the examiner, not just water running up the beach, use the word swash, use the word backwash when water returns to the sea. It tends to be more powerful as it arrives, depending on moon, season, wind speed. So wind, moon, and season. Now, when it's a full moon, actually, which is the most powerful. And then when you get those three combination, when the three things happen together, sometimes it's described as the perfect storm. And if we think about Norfolk, in 1953, there's a case study where most of Norfolk was flooded because in the perfect storm, it was a high tide, there was a full moon. So the high tide came because of the wind. So it was a high tide. full moon, wind, you get the perfect storm. That's when you get your maximum damage. It only takes one storm to knock out the coastline in Norfolk, and that's why it's so devastating. So soft engineering is the idea that when the beach gets taken away by nature, we can either dredge out into the sea, so we can literally get boats out here and we can dredge. So you get your big digger, you fill your boat, you take it inland, you get your JCB, and you put your sand back on the beach. So there are places in the world that actually have yellow beaches because the black beaches weren't what tourists wanted. So they've imported and moved sand around. And what you have here are the JCB diggers putting sand onto a beach because the more sand there is, the more likely it is to stay rather than to be eroded. People like beaches. If you go to Brighton, there are hundreds and hundreds of people sitting side by side because they want to be close to the sea. Being next to the sea not only is fun for swimming, but people find it's restorative for them. So tourism and coastlines are big business. The trouble with moving sand is that it's expensive in terms of it takes a lot of man hours. It's easy to move around because you can put it in a JCB, but it takes a long time and the sand has to be transported somewhere else. It might be that it's from a boat, which has dug up the beach as it's slipped out, or it might literally be imported from another part of the country. Tourism makes it worth it. Soft engineering. When you reprofile the beach, planting along the shoreline, the sediment is moved from the lower part of the beach to the higher part of the beach. It's done because it's cheap, it's simple, it's effective, and it helps decrease the energy of the waves. But again, monitoring the kind of waves, there are different kinds of waves. There are waves that add material to beaches, they're called constructive waves, and then there are waves which take material away, and they are destructive waves. And the ones destructive waves take away material. And these factors have to be considered when deciding how we are going to manage the coastline for our tourists and our local community. Because when we talk about tourists, we're not just talking about people who might be 5 or 10 miles away from the sea. We're talking about people who might travel for 3 or 4 hours to get to a seaside, to go on holiday. And when they get there, they want the lovely experience of a clean beach, clean water, somewhere nice to stay. And so, again, it's the financial investment of how many tourists have we got? What do we do to ensure that they have got their needs met? The community has got its needs met. Can we afford to do it as a local council? Is there any money coming from national sources? So then you start looking at exam questions. And there's a question here. It says, to what extent is hard engineering the best way to protect the town of Borth from further erosion? Now, the first thing that we notice is that there are 8 marks here for answering the question, and there are 3 marks here for spelling, grammar, and punctuation. So we need to try and think about not only our English spelling, but the spelling of our geographical vocabulary. And geographical vocabulary comes with using it so that you become fluent and familiar. If you recall the idea of practicing, make sure that you understand your key words. So looking at this question, we've got 8 marks. It's supposed to be the idea of perhaps a balanced argument on one hand, on the other hand. So hard engineering for hard engineering, soft engineering. And it might be that when you've written your answer, that it's very obvious that the choice is going to be hard engineering, but you need to consider your evidence. So first thing I would do, looking for 8 marks, I would think about the location of Borth. I would look at this Ordnance Survey map. Borth is somewhere in this region, just south of, it's just on the edge of the map. The original of this was slightly bigger, but you could show that you understand your grid references. You could describe it as being north, south, east or west. So, for example, Borth is on the west coast of Wales. It is a town which lies in the mouth of the River Dyfi. It has a small population, and one of the features that it has, which makes it an interesting place to visit, is that there is a railway track. The coastal features that we can look at is that there is this idea of a spit. Now, this spit has been formed because of the sediment drifting up and across the river mouth. And it's here that you have, so we've got the spit, you've got sand dunes, and people are attracted because it's low pressure kind of tourism. It's not the high intensity example of if you go to Brighton, there are hundreds of people on the beach. When you go to Borth, it's peaceful, it's relaxed, it's much quieter. So if we're going to think about hard engineering to protect the town of Borth from further erosion, we need to think about what is it that we are actually protecting around the town of Borth. We actually are thinking about managing this area of the spit because this is soft area. It's sediment that has come over the centuries because it's been carried up the sea and it's been built upon because as it's become more stable, so it's been covered with vegetation and people have been tempted to venture out, so they have built roads, and you can see that there is, for example, you might mention that there's a car park at that grid reference. So why do we want hard engineering to protect the town of Borth? Where is it? What is it made from? Why do we need to protect it? Because it's a place where people want to go. Bird watching, sea lion, sea life. It's a place of, in some ways, it's a sanctuary for humans and animals. So hard engineering. If we think about hard engineering, we think about groins, we think about seawalls, and we think about gabions, and we think about riprap. So those are the four things that we might consider: groins, seawalls, riprap, gabions. Gabions are the cages. Okay, if you can't remember the word cage, gabion, don't worry, just describe it as a cage full of rocks. You'll still get a mark for it. If you can't remember it's a groin, think about, describe them as sleepers that have been put out into the sea. They are walls made of wood. By saying that they're a groin, that will give you an extra mark. But to describe them will also give you a mark. So if you do two both, then you are sounding more fluent in the way that you're communicating with your examiner. Soft engineering. Soft engineering is the sand dunes, and in this area as well, there's something called mud flats. This particular area here, when the river is tidal, you get when the water is quite saline, is brackish water you get here. Hang on, need to make a space to write brackish. It's where you get salt water and fresh water mixing. You end up with mud flats, and mud flats in themselves grow low-level vegetation. One of the things that you can talk about with sand dunes is marram grass. So here we've got some ideas that we want to put into our answer. We have got 8 marks to look at. So the first thing we're going to think about is, where is it? How can we locate it? Why is it important? It's the who, it's the where, oh, come on, talk to me, be nice to me, thank you. Where, what, when, which, how, who. If you can think of those questions when you are going to these 8 marks questions, you think about where is it, what is it, when was it first populated, Victorian times, give some grid references, just use your compass points, and then describe what hard engineering is, that you've got groins, riprap, seawalls, gabions. It is unattractive, it's really costly. Is it appropriate? Probably not. Why? Because soft engineering is a more natural, balanced place within this environment. It kind of fits more easily because time has settled the and established this spit with the presence of it's been well established because it's been built upon for a long time. So what they're trying to do is just make sure that it doesn't get destroyed. What extent is hard engineering the best way to protect the town of Birth from further erosion? You then have to draw a concluding statement whether you think that groins are better than the soft engineering. It is for you to decide. You have to consider and weigh up the arguments. On the one hand, on the other hand, I've got this evidence in this side, and I've got, oh, sorry, I've got that evidence. No. I've got my on one hand, I've got all these heavy, expensive things, and on the other hand, I've got the more natural. And it's which one is the best for both, not for Aberavon, not for the Maldives, not for the east coast of England. It's specifically for both. And your concluding sentence should say, in conclusion, I think, and you need to fill in that final sentence. So, coastal management plans. Coastal communities have been around ever since the Vikings invaded from Norway. They have been places for people to go fishing. They are places where people leave countries and land in countries. You have ports, you have places where industry is imported. And so the relationship between the coast and inland isn't just about the coastal community, it is about the country as a whole. So there is an expectation that the government will help them to protect their homes from erosion and flooding. However, it is expensive. In addition to this, there's no legal obligation for the government to build coastal defences to protect people and their possessions. So if you buy a house which is very close to the sea, including a holiday caravan, and it floods, some of the risk has to be yours because the government can't anticipate every flood that's going to come. But there is a duty of councils in Wales and England to prepare a coastline management plan. Whilst deciding whether it's necessary to build new coastal defences or repair the old ones, the local council needs to consider the advantages of building defences against the building costs. They are likely to consider factors such as how many people are under threat from erosion and how much is the worth of their properties. So if you were to go to Norfolk, it might well be that somebody's property on the seaside is worth 40,000 to one individual. But when you take a community as a whole, you might be looking at millions of pounds worth of money. However, you might also be looking at millions of pounds worth of investment, which experience shows in 40 years you could invest £1 million in trying to stop coastal erosion in Norfolk, and in one night half of it could be destroyed. So there's a real need to consider whether you just do nothing and let these properties fall into the sea, or whether you pay people compensation, because people lose everything. They need something to move to. So we think about how much would it cost to create a new infrastructure, roads, railway lines, and if they were washed away. If, for example, you had an Ordnance Survey map come up in the exam and you get a coast next, you've got your coastline, and you've got a little road, and then you've got another little road here, and all of this has been eroded because of the sea. That infrastructure, the road would have gone round at one point, and there are real places in Norfolk which literally, if you drive down the end of the road, it stops at the seaside because the coast has taken all of this north. Are there any historical or natural features that should be protected? Do these features have any economic worth, for example, of attracting tourists into the area? The most likely economic feature would be something like a lighthouse. They are in themselves designed to withstand storms. So we have to think about economic worth, for example, attracting tourists to the area. Caravan parks, for example. If you're going to build a caravan park, don't build it right next to the sea because it will disappear before your tourists have come to stay. So, coastal management plans. Literally, an option is to do nothing and allow slow erosion. And we do talk about slow. We don't talk about this sudden overnight dramatic effect thing. Quite often, when it's a do nothing thing, it's because erosion is slow, imperceptible. You don't notice it. Where it says keep the line, use hard engineering such as wooden or rock groins and a concrete seawall to protect the coastline. That is quite a common feature in, quite often when you get groins, you do get seawall. The two things happen to go hand in hand, simply because the area that the groins are being built and the seawall is being built is a high energy environment. So this is a low energy, this would be high energy. Retreat line. Make a hole in the defences, letting water move through naturally between tidal periods, between high and low. One of the things that happens with a seawall, this is my seawall, these are my riprap, here is the seawall, here is the road. When you get a massive wave which overtops, the water has to be able to get out again. And that would be the retreat line, where you make a hole in the defences to let the water move through between the tidal periods. Water trapped is expensive and costly. People don't want to stand in it. People don't want to drive in it. Cars get eroded because of the salt, so it needs to be given a facility to escape fairly quickly. Move forward with the line. Build new coastal defences further out to sea. Sometimes that might involve, here is my beach, here is my house, and here we might dump a sandbank out, because that will break up the energy of the wave before it runs up the beach. So if you've got this situation, the chances are that the dominant kind of wave is destructive because it's dragging the sand back down again. So we have to think about where do we break up the energy of these waves as they travel hundreds of miles across the Atlantic. So thinking back to Borth, Ceredigion County Council, whether you are an individual or a member of the County Council itself, everybody can say, I need some help. And they have to consider, what do we need? What is the best thing that we can do for our local community? If we do nothing, we get loss of property and we get economic loss in the short term. It says it would change Borth Bog. Well, Borth Bog is the mud flats that we were talking about. So they are important. So we might pay them a bit more attention. If we hold the line, the current policy which protects the property and the business is disrupted with a reduction of longshore drift. So that would be the building of groins and encouraging sand dunes. Now you can encourage sand dunes with careful planting of marram grass. So if you can't remember marram, it is what's lovely about marram is if you get a little sand dune like this and you get a little bit of marram grass growing up through, and then next year you get a bit more sand coming, instead of the sand overwhelming and killing off the marram, all the marram does is go, okay, I'll keep growing. And as they grow, so the weeds, the roots go down and the sand gets held within the structure of the marram grass, which is why when you go to these areas, you shouldn't pull up the marram grass because it will destroy the what we call the integrity, the strength of the sand dune. When we think about retreating, retreat would affect homes that are immediately behind the existing line of defence. If stuff's retreating, we don't need to worry about it, so we don't need to take any further action. If it's advantage, we no need to advance the line except to improve the tourist facilities, so we don't need to consider further action. So there are, excuse me, change, not change, cost, money, people and communities. Now, one of the things that you can take your time to do later on is to come back to this slide. You may have well seen it already. It says the task is to summarise the information in a table by noting the economic, social and environmental impacts. Your table. So you've got a piece of paper. You have 3 boxes, but you've got a 4th because you've got the who. Who is involved? What are the economic? Now, if we think back to our presentation last week where we talked about MAPS SEEP, we've got social, economic and environmental factors to consider. Who have we got? We've got a scientist. We've got sand from the southern area of the beach is being eroded by longshore drift. You can have economic, environmental. I call that physical as well sometimes. So you've got sand from southern area longshore, that would go into that one, longshore drift. Moving it northwards, the process is happening faster than the new sand being deposited. Beach gets thinner, and so there's quite a bit that goes into that environmental and physical. Then you've got the B&B owner, then you've got another scientist, and then you've got a local councillor. So what you'll end up with is you will have processed and thought about this information, because this is quite good at giving you knowledge. When you've made your table, the next thing that you can do is you can make yourself some flashcards, and you can test each other and test yourself by the way you not only write that information once, but how you look at it again and think about it. The more you revise, the more you consolidate, the more comfortable you become with, for example, seeing that where they've put social, economic and environmental factors. My thinking says, well, I'm going to do SEEP. Then I know I'm kind of having a logic to my learning. Fourth, Ceredigion. The council's plan is to keep the line to continue protecting the community of Borth. Take down the wooden groins and build 4 new rock groins, right? Rock, harder, more resistant to erosion. It's the resistance bit. It might be more expensive. Not quite sure. This is not writing. Resistance. Right, rocks are resistant to erosion. Woods tends to be a little bit more vulnerable. Ensure that the beachfront of the village is wider, preventing floods. The longer the waves have to run up before it hits the community, the less the energy will have when it arrives at somebody's front door. A riff of rocks parallel to the shore at the southern end of the tongue to break the powerful waves so that the waves lose energy and encourage deposition. That riff is what we call the riprap. So you might get a huge pile of not only riprap but gabions as well. And and it said the plan cost 18 million and was completed in 2015. It says explain one coastal management plan and what happened to stop erosion. So here we've got a coastal management plan and what happened to stop the erosion. Take that information, process it, and put it into your own answer. There are 4 marks there, and it will answer that question perfectly. So, why are some communities more vulnerable to damage than others? Simply, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. You've got on the left-hand side, you've got hotels who accommodate visitors in the summer. And then you have got communities living in lowland areas such as Bangladesh, the Maldives, and they may be lower income countries, but they're just as vulnerable because human lives are valuable, human incomes are valuable. And why are some communities more vulnerable to damage than others? It's where they are located. So, nature that vulnerable to damage. Evidence of people inability to cope with disasters, coastal floods. Groups of people are more vulnerable to damage because they're closer. Money, age, gender, disability. Go back one slide. Let's think about why are some communities more vulnerable to damage than other communities. You need to think about the geology. You can think about proximity is a good word. Proximity to the coast. In other words, the closer you are, the more likely you are to flood. It would literally take feet for the whole of that particular island to have those houses wiped out. But when you think about how flat that is, where are those people going to go? So we need to think about the vulnerability of community to damage. Some are more because they have more money. Right, so higher income countries may put, and I do say may put more money into coastal defences, or they may not. It depends on what has to be considered. So, the nature that's vulnerable to damage. There's evidence that people have inability to cope with disaster and coastal floods. If you were to look at Bangladesh, for example, Bangladesh is a naturally low-lying country and it is prone to flooding for 2 reasons. One, because the water comes up from the sea, but also because of the nature of the rivers that flood into the area. So the closer you are to the sea, the more proximal you are to the sea, the more likely you are to be submerged. And it costs, every time your house floods, you have to dry it out, you have to buy new bedding, you have to buy new equipment because it's been washed away by the sea. And the older you get, the harder it gets to keep replacing those things that you've lost. Men tend to be physically more able to cope with repairing buildings than women. It is the nature of the thing. So if you have communities which are heavily based on farming, for example, then you might find that the male members of the community are staying, but the male members of the community are also the people who are more likely to leave to go and seek employment elsewhere, send money home. And people with disabilities really struggle when it comes to living in coastal environments because should something happen, they find it more difficult to leave. Why are some communities more vulnerable to others? Right, we have extreme weather, location and distance of the coast. Here we've got a road collapsing. That would be called a slip, a landslide. Type of rock, more vulnerable to erosion, climate change, global warming, natural hazards. Haven't talked about tsunamis in this feature, but if you think about, go back to the earthquakes and volcanoes presentation, tsunamis do massive damage to coasts because of the size and nature of the energy within the waves. Why are some communities more vulnerable to damage than others? It's very difficult to comprehend that every day that you stand next to the sea and it's beautiful and calm, that by the time you get to the depths of winter, suddenly overnight the beach disappears. Experience will show you, And the way we get experience is through education. It's not only about writing things down, it's about talking to people. Age and health. Older people with mobility issues or those without anybody to help them, pregnant women, children and people with disability are also vulnerable to harm. The quality of the emergency services and coastal defences. Many low-income countries can't afford to protect them at all. You have individual community wealth. Unemployed people or those on benefits often are unable to protect themselves. Population density, the higher the population and the greater the area of risk. Rivers, flooding, coastal flooding, cause and effect, same sort of thing. The time of day. In natural disasters often occur in the early hour of the morning. It's possible that many people will be asleep. Why does it happen in the early hours of the morning? Because it does. So when you come to answering your questions, think about the way you use your connectives. So because of, in account of, as a result, this means therefore, it can be seen that. Make your writing interesting. Describe one social factor and one economic factor that can mean coastal communities are more vulnerable. It's asking you to do 1 and 3. So 1 social factor is education. 3 is development of the country. That is, a low country will be more vulnerable, a lack of coastal management. Therefore, there's the connective, there will be more people at risk. Don't be right to show off. How could climate change affect coastal communities? Okay, here you've got a global map. And you can see that you've got certain areas which are going to be more prone to flooding. You've got the Maldives, you've got the area in the South China Sea, Marshall Islands. These are places that people like to go on holiday. So people want to keep them, so they invest money. By 2030, estimates suggest that 950 people around the world will be living in a low elevation coastal zone. These coastal zones are lower than 10 metres above sea level. Now, 10 metres is twice the height of your house. So when you think about an area of land flooding and it's 10 metres, it is highly likely that you will be drowning. Okay, sorry, a little bit. Let's go back a bit. Thinking about the location, you have to think about the comments, the neighbouring countries, the compass direction. When you are actually asked to describe the location of the Maldives, north of the equator, living in Arabian Sea, Indian Ocean, it's an atoll, which is in itself a word that you can describe. So how can they affect it? The Maldives build property on stilts and build them higher. Small developing states, SIDS, small developing island states. There are currently 58 with 56 million. These people matter just the same as anybody in New York or in Alaska. Just because they live on an island doesn't mean to say that they're any less important. The case studies. Get to know the Maldives as an example where they have thought about their social, environmental and economic activities. There's your C. Go away and study that. Environmental refugees, people who are forced to evacuate their homes because of a natural disaster such as coastal flooding, drought or climate change. What impact can environmental refugees have on a high economic income country? What impact can taking an environmental refugee have on a low income country? Basically, it's how many people can you accommodate comfortably? And they've given you this idea that the Maldivian president his government was considering Australia as a new home. Where do you relocate an entire community if it's no longer safe to live in a place? You have to be welcome guests somewhere. So thinking about the effects of rising sea levels on small islands, weighing up the effects where it says evaluate, are the worst effects the social ones, naming a small island developing state, what is the impact, the social, economic, what's the evidence, and draw your conclusion. There are 6 marks here, so write to 6 marks. And there we have it. It's the idea that you have got coastal planning methods. Some areas are more vulnerable to damage. The difference between hard engineering, soft engineering, and how can climate change affect coastal communities? So 10 metres, here is your house. Here is the sea. Over time, sea level rises, and before you know it, everything that was your home no longer exists. So how does the government solve the problem that you haven't got a home to live in? Does it take you to another country, or does it relocate you further inland?